His hands were shaking, not from cold, not from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he had just done. Caleb Whitmore, the man who controlled billion-dollar empires without flinching, sat on the edge of his bed, with tears streaming down his face. Beside him, a young woman barely half his age lay still, her fingers tracing the outline of an old locket against her chest, a locket she had carried since she was 12 years old. And when she whispered those words, "You were my only dream," something inside him shattered, not from joy, from recognition. Because in that moment, Caleb realized he hadn't just crossed a line. He had stumbled into a truth that would change everything, a truth she didn't yet know, and one he could never take back. The chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation cast fractured light across 500 faces, but Caleb saw none of them. He stood near the bar with a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched, watching the crowd move like a tide he wanted no part of. The annual gala for the Children's Hope Initiative, his late wife's creation, had become the one night each year he couldn't escape. Donors wanted handshakes, board members wanted promises, and everyone wanted to tell him how proud Margaret would have been. 5 years since she died, and her ghost still ran this room better than he ever could. Caleb's jaw tightened as a woman in emerald silk approached with that look, the one that said she'd rehearsed her condolences in the mirror. He turned before she could reach him, slipping through a service door into the corridor beyond. The silence hit him like cold water. He leaned against the wall and pulled out his wallet, not for money, but for the photograph he kept behind his driver's license. Margaret laughing in the garden, sunlight catching the auburn in her hair. And beside her, barely visible at the edge of the frame, a young girl he'd never asked about. A child with dark hair and serious eyes, maybe 11 or 12. He'd noticed her the day after Margaret's funeral, when he was sorting through her things. He'd meant to ask. But grief had swallowed the question, and eventually he stopped wondering. A crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the building, followed by a small voice crying. Caleb straightened. He knew that voice. He moved without thinking, his polished shoes silent against the marble as he followed the sound through a maze of catering stations and storage rooms. He found his son in a supply closet, surrounded by fallen boxes of napkins, tears streaming down his face. And kneeling beside him, speaking in a voice so gentle it barely carried, was a young woman in a server's uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her hands, small and careful, were brushing dust from Theo's jacket. She looked up as Caleb appeared in the doorway, and something in her eyes made him stop breathing. Not fear, not deference. Recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. "He got lost looking for the bathroom," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "The boxes fell when he tried to climb through." "He's not hurt." Theo spotted his father and launched himself forward, wrapping his arms around Caleb's legs with the desperation of a 7-year-old who'd wandered too far from safety. Caleb lifted him automatically, feeling the boy's rapid heartbeat against his chest, but his eyes stayed on the woman. She was already standing, already stepping back, already preparing to disappear into the machinery of the event. "Wait," Caleb said. The word came out sharper than he intended. She paused, her expression unreadable. "What's your name?" A beat of silence. Then, Wren Holloway. She said it like an apology, like her name was something she'd learned not to offer freely. Theo lifted his head from Caleb's shoulder. "She sang to me, Daddy, the scared-away song, like Mommy used to." The words hit Caleb like a fist. Margaret had sung that song, a half-remembered lullaby from her own childhood, whenever Theo had nightmares. She'd never written it down, never recorded it. How could this stranger possibly know it? Wren's face had gone pale. "I should get back to work," she said quickly, but Theo was already reaching for her, his small hand catching the edge of her sleeve. "No, I want the singing lady to stay." Caleb watched Wren's expression shift. Surprise, then something softer, almost wounded. She looked at Theo the way someone looks at a photograph of a place they've never been, but somehow remember. "I'm sorry," she said softly, gently freeing her sleeve from his grip. "I can't stay." She was gone before Caleb could ask the question burning in his throat. "Where did you learn that song?" The next morning, Caleb sat in his home office with his laptop open to a background check he'd ordered at 2 a.m. Wren Holloway, 23 years old, aged out of the foster system at 18. No criminal record, no family, no fixed address until 3 years ago, when she'd started working for the catering company that serviced his events. The file was thin, remarkably thin for someone who'd spent her entire life in state custody. But one detail caught his attention. From ages 12 to 14, her education had been funded by an anonymous sponsor through the Whitmore Foundation, the same foundation his wife had built, the same foundation that had no record of who that sponsor was. Caleb stared at the photograph attached to the file, a girl of 12 with dark hair and serious eyes. Standing in front of a group home with her arms crossed over her chest, and around her neck, just visible above the collar of her shirt, was a locket. The same locket he'd seen her wearing last night. His hand moved to his wallet, to the photograph of Margaret and the unknown child. The resemblance was undeniable. He picked up his phone and dialed the number the catering company had provided. It rang 3 times. "Hello?" Her voice was wary, guarded, the voice of someone who'd learned that phone calls rarely brought good news. "Miss Holloway, this is Caleb Whitmore. I have a proposition for you." Silence stretched between them, thick with something neither of them could name. "I'm listening," she said finally. And Caleb began to speak. 3 weeks later, Wren stood in the foyer of the Whitmore estate, her single suitcase looking absurdly small against the marble floors and soaring ceilings. Theo had spotted her from the top of the staircase and came barreling down with a shriek of joy, nearly knocking her over in his enthusiasm. "You came back. Daddy said you might not come back, but I knew you would." Wren caught him, laughing despite herself, and Caleb watched from the doorway of his study with an expression he couldn't quite control. She was wearing jeans and a simple white blouse, nothing like the server's uniform, and the transformation was startling. She looked younger, softer, more vulnerable than he'd let himself notice before. The first month passed in a blur of routines and revelations. Wren was patient with Theo in a way that felt instinctive, not performed. She read to him without checking her phone. She listened to his rambling stories about dinosaurs and superheroes without interrupting. She knew somehow exactly when he needed comfort and when he needed space. And she sang, always, that same lullaby, the one Margaret had sung, the one no one else should know. Caleb found himself lingering in doorways, watching her with Theo, trying to understand the strange ache in his chest. It wasn't attraction. Not yet. It was something older, something that felt like déjà vu, like he was witnessing something that had always been meant to happen. The night everything changed began with a thunderstorm. Caleb was in his study, pretending to read quarterly reports, when he heard Theo's scream pierce the darkness. He was halfway up the stairs when he saw Wren emerge from the guest room, her hair loose around her shoulders, her feet bare against the cold floor. She reached Theo's room first. By the time Caleb arrived, she was already on the bed, holding his son against her chest, humming that haunting melody, while lightning turned the windows white. Theo's sobs gradually softened into hiccups, then silence, then the deep breathing of sleep. Wren didn't move. She sat in the darkness, cradling Caleb's son like something precious, like something she'd been waiting her whole life to protect. "Where did you learn that song?" Caleb's voice was barely a whisper. Wren's eyes met his across the dim room. "A woman taught it to me," she said. "When I was 12, she used to visit me at the group home every Saturday. She brought books and art supplies, and her voice caught, and she sang to me. Every time. That exact song. Caleb's heart was pounding. What happened to her? Wren's hand moved to the locket at her throat, the unconscious gesture of someone touching a wound. She stopped coming. One day she just stopped. No letter. No explanation. I waited for her every Saturday for 2 years. She never came back. The storm outside had quieted, but Caleb felt like he was standing in the eye of something far more dangerous. Do you know her name? Wren shook her head. She never told me. She said names weren't important. She said, her voice broke slightly. She said what mattered was that I knew someone cared. She looked down at Theo, still sleeping peacefully in her arms. I kept the locket she gave me. It's the only proof I have that she was real. Caleb couldn't breathe. He knew, with a certainty that bordered on nausea, what he would see if he asked to look at that locket. But he couldn't make himself ask. Not yet. Not while his son slept in the arms of a woman who might be the answer to a question he'd never thought to ask. Instead, he said, "Get some rest. We'll talk tomorrow." He backed out of the room like a man retreating from a fire, his mind racing through possibilities he wasn't ready to face. Margaret had kept secrets. He'd always known that. But this felt like discovering a hidden room in a house he thought he knew completely. And Wren, sleeping down the hall with her mysterious locket and her impossible song, held the key. The following weeks were a slow descent into something Caleb couldn't name. He started finding excuses to be home earlier. He took meals with Theo and Wren instead of eating alone in his study. He listened to her stories about growing up in foster care, the homes that ranged from neglectful to cruel, the caseworkers who never remembered her name, the constant relocation that made it impossible to keep friends or trust anyone. She told these stories without self-pity, like weather reports from a country she'd long since left. But her eyes, when she thought no one was watching, held a loneliness so vast it made Caleb's chest ache. Vivian Whitmore arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, her silver Mercedes pulling into the driveway like a declaration of war. Caleb's mother had opinions about everything: his business decisions, his parenting, his stubborn refusal to remarry. But she'd been particularly vocal about his decision to hire a nanny without her input. She swept into the foyer with the air of someone inspecting a property she was considering purchasing, her eyes landing on Wren with undisguised suspicion. "So this is the girl," Vivian said, not bothering to lower her voice. "The one from the catering company." Wren stood her ground, though Caleb could see the tension in her shoulders. "I'm Wren Holloway, Mrs. Whitmore. It's nice to meet you." Vivian's smile was surgical. "I'm sure it is." The interrogation that followed was subtle but relentless. Vivian wanted to know where Wren had gone to school, nowhere impressive. Who her family was, no one. What her qualifications were, none formal. With each answer, her expression grew more contemptuous. "I had someone look into your background," she said finally, setting down her teacup with a decisive click. "You were removed from 3 foster homes for behavioral issues. Care to explain?" Wren's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone who'd learned long ago that showing hurt only made it worse. "I was removed," she said quietly, "because I reported a foster father who was hitting the younger children. The agency found it easier to move me than to investigate him." Silence. Vivian's lips pressed into a thin line. How convenient that there's no way to verify that story. Caleb stepped forward. "Mother, that's enough." His voice was cold, in a way it rarely was with her. "Wren is an employee of this household. She's also been extraordinary with Theo. I won't have her subjected to what? Due diligence?" Vivian rose, gathering her purse. "You've always had a blind spot for strays, Caleb. Just like Margaret did." She paused at the door, her parting shot aimed with precision. "I wonder if that's why you chose this particular one." That night, Caleb found Wren on the back patio, staring at the garden where Margaret had once spent hours cultivating roses. Her arms were wrapped around herself against the evening chill, and the locket glinted at her throat in the fading light. "I should go," she said, without turning around. "Your mother is right. I don't belong here." Caleb moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, but not close enough to touch. "My mother," he said carefully, "has spent her entire life believing that belonging is something you inherit, not something you earn." He paused. "I don't share that belief." Wren finally looked at him. In the dim light, her eyes were luminous, filled with something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Why did you hire me?" "Really?" The question hung between them like smoke. Caleb considered lying, something about her qualifications, her rapport with Theo, her impeccable references that didn't exist. But the truth came out instead, rough and unpolished. "Because when I saw you with my son, I felt like I was seeing something I'd been looking for without knowing it. Something that was supposed to be here all along." The tension between them grew like vines through cracks in stone. Slowly, inevitably, impossible to stop. Caleb began noticing things he had no business noticing. The way Wren tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the sound of her laughter floating up from the garden where she played with Theo, the particular grace of her hands as she folded laundry or turned pages. He was 45 years old. She was barely 23. He was her employer, the man who signed her paychecks, the only stability she'd ever known. Every rule he'd ever set for himself screamed that this was wrong. But the heart, as Margaret had once told him, doesn't read the employee handbook. The discovery happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 months after Wren arrived. Theo had been playing dress-up in the attic, dragging out boxes of Margaret's old things that Caleb had never had the strength to sort. Wren was helping him, laughing at his attempts to walk in oversized heels when Theo pulled out a photograph album and froze. "Daddy! Daddy, come look!" Caleb climbed the attic stairs with a sense of dread he couldn't explain. Theo was pointing at a photograph, his face screwed up in concentration. "That lady looks like the lady in Wren's necklace." The world stopped. Caleb looked at the photograph, Margaret at some charity event, smiling, radiant, and then at Wren, whose face had gone white as paper. Her hand was at her throat, clutching the locket like a talisman. She breathed. "That's her. That's my—" She couldn't finish. Her fingers fumbled with the locket's clasp until it finally opened, revealing the tiny photograph inside. Margaret. Younger, but unmistakably Margaret. "She was my sponsor," Wren whispered. "She was the woman who came every Saturday. She was." Her eyes met Caleb's, and in them he saw the terrible dawning of understanding. "She was your wife." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Caleb had ever heard. He took the locket from Wren's trembling hands and stared at the face of the woman he'd loved, the woman he'd buried, the woman who had apparently been living a secret life that revolved around this girl, this woman standing before him. "I don't understand," Wren said, her voice cracking. Why did she stop?" "She got sick," Caleb heard himself say. The words felt like they were coming from very far away. 5.5 years ago, cancer. She died 14 months later. Wren's knees buckled. She caught herself on a dusty trunk, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "She was going to adopt me," she said. "She told me. She said when I turned 14, she was going to bring me home. She said I was going to have a family. A real family." She looked around the attic with wild eyes, at the boxes and photographs and remnants of a life she'd been promised but never received. This was supposed to be my home. Caleb felt something shift inside him, a tectonic movement that rearranged everything he thought he understood about his wife, his household, his heart. Margaret had found this girl. Margaret had loved this girl. Margaret had planned to bring her into their family without ever telling him. And then Margaret had gotten sick, and, rather than burden a child with her impending death, had simply vanished from Wren's life without explanation. It was an act of cruelty that Margaret would have called mercy. It was a wound that had never healed. "She never told me," Caleb said, the words scraping his throat raw. "I didn't know about you. I didn't know about any of this." Wren was crying now, silent tears that carved tracks down her cheeks. "For 11 years, she said. I thought I'd done something wrong. I thought she left because I wasn't good enough. I thought she couldn't continue." Theo, forgotten in the corner, came forward and wrapped his arms around her legs with the simple instinct of a child who recognizes pain. "Don't be sad, Wren. My mommy loved you too. She must have, because she was the best at loving people." From that moment forward, something fundamental changed between Caleb and Wren. They circled each other like planets whose orbits had shifted, aware of a new gravity, terrified of what it might mean. Caleb told her everything he could remember about Margaret's illness, the diagnosis, the treatments, the final months when she'd been too weak to leave her bed. Wren listened with an expression that broke his heart, grief for a woman she'd loved, anger at a woman who'd abandoned her, confusion about how to reconcile the two. They talked for hours, sometimes until dawn, about Margaret and Wren's childhood and the strange hand of fate that had brought them to this moment. And somewhere in those long nights, the boundary between employer and employee, between benefactor and beneficiary, between man and woman, began to dissolve. Vivian's investigation bore fruit in early winter. She arrived at the house with a folder thick with documents, her expression triumphant. "I found something interesting about your little foundling," she announced, spreading papers across Caleb's desk. She was expelled from the group home at 16, not transferred. Expelled. The official reason is listed as violent behavior towards staff. Wren, who had been summoned like a defendant to a trial, stood rigid by the window. "That's not what happened," she said quietly. "Then enlighten us," Vivian replied, her tone dripping with false sweetness. Wren's hands were trembling, but her voice held steady. "A staff member was hurting one of the younger children. I tried to stop him. He said I attacked him. They believed him. That's the story." She turned to face Vivian directly. "I would do it again." Caleb looked at his mother, at the papers designed to destroy Wren's reputation, at the woman she was so determined to drive away. "Mother," he said, "I think it's time for you to leave." Vivian's composure cracked. "Caleb, you can't possibly." "I can. And I am." He crossed to Wren and stood beside her, not touching, but close enough that his intention was unmistakable. "Wren has been nothing but devoted to this family. She's shown more integrity in the face of your attacks than I've seen from anyone in years. If you can't treat her with basic respect, you're not welcome in this house." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Then Vivian gathered her papers, her dignity, and what remained of her composure, and walked out without another word. Caleb turned to Wren, who was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes," he replied. "I did." The gala came around again. Another year, another night of performed philanthropy in Margaret's memory. But this time, Caleb didn't hide by the bar. He stood near the entrance of the ballroom with Wren beside him, watching Theo charm elderly donors with his gap-toothed smile and endless energy. She was wearing a simple black dress that Caleb had insisted on paying for, despite her protests. The locket hung at her throat as it always did, a reminder of connections lost and found. "1 year ago," Wren said softly. "I was serving champagne at this event. I never imagined I'd be standing here like this." Caleb turned to look at her. In the warm light, she was beautiful. not the calculated beauty of the society women around them, but something realer, something earned. Neither did I, he admitted. But I'm glad you are. The explosion came later that evening, courtesy of a donor's wife who'd had too much champagne and too little discretion. Such a touching story, the woman gushed, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. The billionaire and the orphan. It's like something out of a fairy tale. She leaned closer to Wren with a conspiratorial smile. Though I suppose some people might wonder about the, shall we say, convenience of it all. Poor girl gets taken in by a rich widower, becomes indispensable to his son, and suddenly she's wearing designer dresses and standing beside him at galas. Her implication was impossible to miss. Wren went still, her face a mask of carefully controlled hurt. Caleb felt something ignite in his chest, anger, protective and fierce. But before he could speak, Vivian appeared at his elbow. She'd been watching from across the room, and her expression was unreadable. "Mrs. Patterson," Vivian said, her voice carrying the particular frost reserved for social annihilation. "I don't believe I heard you correctly. Surely you weren't suggesting something sordid about a young woman who has shown nothing but dedication to my grandson's welfare?" The silence that followed was deafening. Vivian continued, each word a precisely aimed blade. "Because if you were, I would have to remind you that the Whitmore Foundation, which funded your husband's last 3 development projects, takes a dim view of malicious gossip, particularly when it targets vulnerable young people, which is, after all, our mission." Mrs. Patterson stammered an apology and retreated. Vivian turned to Wren, and something in her expression had shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a grudging respect. "Don't let women like that see you bleed," she said quietly. "They feed on it." Then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd like she'd never intervened at all. Wren looked at Caleb, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Did that just happen? He couldn't help but smile. My mother is many things, but she's also fiercely protective of anyone she considers family. He paused, letting the implication settle. I think she's decided you qualify. The night spiraled toward its inevitable conclusion, with the momentum of a stone rolling downhill. After the gala, after the guests had departed and Theo had been tucked into bed, Caleb found Wren in the garden, Margaret's garden, standing among the sleeping roses like a ghost. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "I can't stop thinking about her," she said, "about what she was planning, about the life I almost had." She looked up at the house, at the windows warm with light. "I've been dreaming about this place since I was 12 years old, and now I'm here, and I don't know if I deserve to be." Caleb closed the distance between them. Wren. Her name felt different in his mouth now, heavier, more significant. What Margaret did, keeping you a secret, leaving you without explanation, that was her choice, her mistake. You were a child. You deserved better. He was standing close enough to see the flutter of her pulse at her throat, the way her breath caught when he spoke. You still deserve better. The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable, the culmination of months of circling, of wanting, of holding back. Her lips were soft and tentative, and Caleb felt something crack open inside him that he'd kept sealed since Margaret's death. He pulled back first, breathing hard. "We shouldn't," he said, even as every cell in his body screamed otherwise. "You work for me. You're half my age. I'm an adult," Wren interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've been making my own decisions since I was 12 years old. I know what I want." She reached up and touched his face with a tenderness that undid him completely. "I want you. I've wanted you since the night you found me in that hallway with your son. Not because you're rich, not because you can give me things, because you're the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth finding." What happened next was something Caleb would carry with him for the rest of his life, Not the physical act, though that was seared into his memory with painful clarity, but the aftermath. The moment when they lay tangled together in his bed, breathless and overwhelmed. And Wren turned to him with tears streaming down her face. "You were my only dream," she whispered. "Since I was 12 years old, sitting in that group home, waiting for your wife to come back, I dreamed of a family, a real family. And when I finally gave up on her, I started dreaming of someone like you, someone who would find me and choose me and make me feel like I belonged." Her hand found the locket at her throat. "You were my only dream. And now, you're real." Caleb Whitmore had controlled billion-dollar deals without flinching. He'd buried his wife without breaking. He'd raised his son alone and built an empire from his father's modest inheritance. But in that moment, with those words hanging in the air between them, he broke. Because he understood, finally, the full weight of what had happened. He hadn't just taken her innocence. He had taken it while knowing something she didn't, that the woman in her locket was his wife, that the family she'd dreamed of was his family, that she had been waiting 11 years for a home that had been here all along, just out of reach. He had taken her first time while holding a secret that changed everything. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice ragged. "About Margaret, about why she stopped coming." Wren went still. "What do you mean?" Caleb sat up, unable to look at her while he spoke. "She was diagnosed 6 months before her last visit to you. Stage 4. She knew she was dying." He forced himself to continue. "She made a decision, one I didn't know about until tonight. She decided that if she couldn't be there for you, if she couldn't give you the life she'd promised, she would disappear completely. She thought," his voice broke, "she thought a clean break would hurt less than watching her die." The silence stretched into eternity. When Wren spoke, her voice was hollow. "She chose to let me think I was abandoned. She chose to let me spend 11 years wondering what I did wrong." She was no longer crying. Her tears had frozen into something harder, sharper. "And you knew. You knew who I was, what she'd done, and you still—" She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. Caleb felt the accusation like a knife between his ribs. "I didn't know everything. Not until I saw the locket. Not until tonight." It sounded weak even to his own ears. "But I knew enough, and I should have told you before. Before this." The word encompassed everything. The kiss, the bed, the irrevocable line they'd crossed. Wren was out of bed now, pulling on clothes with the mechanical efficiency of someone operating on pure survival instinct. "I need to go. I need to think. I can't—" She stopped at the door, her hand on the frame. "Did you choose me because of her? Because of guilt? Because you felt like you owed me something?" The question was a scalpel, precise and devastating. Caleb couldn't answer. He didn't know. And his silence was answer enough. The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like the end of everything. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. Wren moved out of the estate and back to a cramped apartment across town. She continued working. She couldn't afford not to, but she arranged her schedule to avoid Caleb entirely. Theo was devastated, crying for his singing lady, with a grief he didn't understand. And Caleb found himself wandering the halls of his home like a stranger, haunted by the ghost of a woman he'd married and the absence of one he'd wronged. He threw himself into work, into foundation meetings, into anything that kept him from thinking. But every night, alone in his bed, he could still smell her shampoo on the pillows. He could still hear her whisper, "You were my only dream." Vivian found him in his study 3 weeks later, staring at nothing. She sat down across from him with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I owe you an apology," she said, words he'd never heard from her before. "When I investigated that girl, I was looking for reasons to distrust her. I found them because I wanted to." She paused. But I also found something else. Something that changes things. She placed a document on his desk. A letter, handwritten, in familiar, elegant script. I found this in Margaret's papers. She wrote it the week before she died. Caleb's hands were shaking as he unfolded the letter. It was addressed to him, a letter Margaret had never sent, words she'd never spoken. In it, she confessed everything. Finding Wren, loving her, planning to adopt her. She explained her decision to disappear, a choice she called the hardest and most selfish thing I've ever done. And at the end, she wrote, "If you ever find her, Caleb, please tell her I'm sorry. Tell her it was never about her. Tell her she was the daughter I never got to keep, and leaving her was the one thing I couldn't forgive myself for. And if she ever needs a home, if she ever needs family, please, be there for her the way I couldn't be." Caleb read the letter 3 times before the words stopped blurring. Margaret had known. She'd known that somehow, someday, Wren might find her way back to them. She'd left instructions, not a will, but a hope, a last request from a dying woman to the husband she was leaving behind. Be there for her. Be family. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been there for Wren. He'd become her family. And then he'd become something more, something complicated, something that might have ruined everything Margaret had hoped for. He found Wren at the coffee shop where she'd taken a second job, because of course she had, because she'd never learned to rely on anyone but herself. She was wiping down tables when he walked in, and her expression when she saw him was a complex equation of pain and longing and fury. "I have something for you," he said. Something Margaret left. He handed her the letter, then stepped back to give her space. He watched her read it, watched her face cycle through shock and grief and something that looked almost like relief. When she finished, she was crying again, but differently this time. Softer. "She loved me," Wren said, more to herself than to him. "She didn't leave because I wasn't good enough. She left because she loved me too much to let me watch her die." She looked up at Caleb with those serious eyes, the same eyes from the photograph he'd carried in his wallet for 5 years. "Why are you showing me this?" Caleb took a deep breath. "Because you deserve to know the truth. All of it." He sat down across from her, uninvited, unwelcome. "I can't take back what happened between us. I can't pretend it was simple, or clean, or right. But I need you to know that whatever guilt I carry about Margaret, that's not why I wanted you." He leaned forward, urgent. "I didn't touch you to pay a debt. I didn't choose you because my dead wife asked me to. I chose you because you walked into my life, and you were kind to my son, and you sang a song that broke my heart, and you—" His voice cracked. "You made me feel like I wasn't alone anymore. For the first time in 5 years. Wren's hands were gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "How do I know that's true? How do I know this isn't just guilt? Obligation? Some twisted way of honoring Margaret's last wish?" The question was fair. The answer was complicated. "You don't," Caleb admitted. "You can't. I can tell you what I feel, but I can't prove it. All I can do is ask for a chance to show you." He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand. "Not as your employer. Not as your benefactor. Not as Margaret's widower. Just as a man who fell in love with you and did it badly, and wants desperately to do it better." Wren stared at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, a broken, tearful sound that held no humor. "You know what the worst part is? I've been sitting in my apartment for 3 weeks, trying to convince myself I hate you, trying to tell myself that what we had was a lie, that you used me, that I was stupid to believe any of it was real." She finally looked at him directly. "But I can't, because when I close my eyes, I don't see the man who kept secrets. I see the man who stood up to his mother for me." The man who held me while I cried about a woman I'd never properly mourned. The man who made his son's nightmares go away just by being there. She wiped her eyes. I don't know if I can trust you again, but I know I want to try. 1 year later, Wren stood in the garden of the Whitmore estate, Margaret's garden, now hers to tend. The roses were blooming, explosions of red and pink and white that would have made their original planter proud. Behind her, the sound of Theo's laughter rang out as he chased a butterfly across the lawn. And beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, stood Caleb. They had rebuilt slowly, painfully from the wreckage of that night. There had been arguments and setbacks, moments when Wren walked out, and moments when Caleb despaired of ever earning back her trust. But they had kept trying, kept talking, kept showing up, kept choosing each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. The wedding had been small, just family, what little they had. Theo as ring-bearer, Vivian in the front row, with tears she would later deny. A handful of friends who'd watched the unlikely romance unfold with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. Wren had worn a simple white dress, and around her neck she'd worn the locket, not as a memorial to what she'd lost, but as a tribute to the strange path that had brought her here, to the woman who'd loved her first and the man who'd found a way to love her second. Now, watching the sunset paint the garden gold, Wren felt something she'd spent her whole life chasing finally settle into place. Belonging. Not the desperate, grasping kind she'd known as a child, the kind that came from wanting so badly to be chosen that you'd become whatever someone needed you to be. This was different. This was being seen for exactly who she was, flaws and wounds and rough edges and all, and being wanted anyway. Caleb's arm came around her waist, and she leaned into him automatically, the gesture as natural now as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. Wren smiled, her hand rising to touch the locket at her throat. "Dreams," she said. "Old ones that died, new ones that lived." She turned to look at him, at this man who had stumbled into her life and changed everything. "I used to think you were my only dream, but I was wrong." She gestured at the garden, at the house, at their son playing in the distance. "This is my dream. All of it. And it's better than anything I could have imagined alone." Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Margaret would be happy," he said quietly, "knowing you found your way here, knowing you found us." Wren nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "I like to think she planned it," she said. "I like to think she knew, somehow, that everything she started would find its way to an ending she'd be proud of. It was a comforting fiction, and maybe that's all it was. But standing in Margaret's garden, wearing Margaret's locket, loving Margaret's widower, Wren chose to believe it anyway. Some dreams die so better, ones can live. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who love you find ways to keep loving you, even after they're gone.